Hi, today I'll be discussing on a presentation on how I visited a Japanese American museum in San Jose. When I first walked in the museum, I noticed how there was a receptionist in the gift shop area. Um, and then going into like the further part of the museum, I noticed how there was uh, like panels and descriptions on the Japanese experience, and there was like artifacts and back then when like the World War I and World War II, basically the wars specifically towards Japanese Americans, and there was like uniforms, um, there was photos taken during the time, and there was bits and pieces of artifacts that was left that they could salvage to use that as an example of to make the experience feel more real. The museum included historical panels, personal letters, and exhibits about forced removals, incarnation, family life, housing, jobs, after the war. The housing and jobs after the war, yeah. What I learned about forced removal and incarnation of Japanese Americans um, is how there was forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast after Pearl Harbor happened. And this panel described discrimination before the war and how prejudice increased afterwards. So it explains how the government ordered Japanese Americans to leave their homes and move to incarnation camps. Nice lady who worked there told me and my friends examples on how it felt when the Japanese Americans were suddenly told that they had to leave their homes, like pack their bags like immediately, and there was like a limit to how much they can like carry. So it was just like pack up and go to whatever place that they were told to go, and they had no idea on what where they're going, like what's gonna happen. So it was overall pretty frightening for them, and they had to prepare for the worst. I also learned that U.S. citizens were also affected, not just immigrants, because there were American citizens that were Japanese, basically Japanese Americans, that was already citizens, and just because they look Japanese, they were just told to go to the incarnation camp. Like it wasn't based on background or whatever they had going on during their lifetime. Seeing and hearing all this happen to the Japanese Americans, it helped me like understand what their situation is and the pressure and the fear of what's gonna happen or what's not gonna happen because they don't know what's gonna happen next. So it basically a big part that played in this incarnation and removal was basically racism. So here's a picture of the incarnation camps and uh the layout of where's everything. Basically the building shaped like an H in the middle is like the shower room where people had to get like the one place where they can get water and where how to shower and basically hygiene, and the room below uh the building below the H building, like the big chunky building is like where they're like all gathered up to eat and have meals and stuff. And the buildings on the sides, you can see like in the bottom, where there's like a house open up with the roof open. It's like basically small little rooms side by side on how many like Japanese Americans were staying in that room. Like you see how there's like four beds, one table, basically just an example to show. And and these were just one little individual rooms side by side in these long um hor- horizontal buildings. And because of these buildings being so long and basically had like no, it was pretty small, like basically the roof, well the wooden structure of the roof could almost hit your head if you're like tall. And it was just like basically that's an example of how small it is and how cramped. Basically with just like for example like four people in one room, it will be really cramped. Around this layout is like there's like barbed wires, um so like you can't escape, and you can see miniature little figures of humans. Basically they're like the soldiers patrolling around the area to make sure that you're not up to do anything funny or like trying to escape. So they were under heavy surveillance, and at the very top of this picture you can see like a standing over, like a wooden structure standing over like all these buildings, and there's like a soldier like trying to keep watch of what's going on and just basically just further surveillance the Japanese Americans that were living there. Museum had like this built accurate room of like the figures picture that I showed you, and you can see how cramped it is. Like beds are side to side with each other, and the roof like there's not. When I first walked into the room, the the floors was very creaky, and the roof like it. Basically, look at the roof right now. It's like still bigger than what I experienced, and this is not really like a big roof. So, but just for comparison, the structure that the building I walked in was pretty small, yeah. And because the rooms were like involve so many people in one specific room, like one by one by one by one, and so on until the building ends. You can basically imagine the end, the end of the first horizontal building is this side, right? And after these 3 or 4 rooms, at the very end, you can still hear, like in this room, you can still hear like any sounds coming from this side of the building, because like if you hear like a baby cry or someone coughing or sneezing, you could hear all the way from here. So if any noise happened, you wouldn't be able to sleep. And it was just overall just there's no privacy going on. As you can see, like they only have like curtains to cover the bed parts of where they're sleeping, basically for changing and stuff. And you can there's like a boiler, but I didn't take a picture of it. But like imagine there's like a black boiler in the middle of the room, and it was like basically the only source of heat that they can get. And in those rooms, they don't have any like water, or like, even though you can see like these cups, or like big bucket, or like to put water in, but like the only place that you can get water is from the H building that I talked to you about in the photo that I showed earlier. They had like no water that could be in that room, so they had to go into that building specifically for water. And when I first walked into that room, I noticed how like it was very small. It was like very cramped. It was very dim, and there was like basically no privacy. And when I first walked in, I heard like a sound, like a sound of playing of like a baby crying. And the lady told me that the sound of the baby crying was from all the way to the end of the room, and you're basically in this room, and the baby's crying, so you could hear the baby. So it's like a real life experience of how these people went through every time when they were incarcerated and moved. After the war ended, I learned that housing section was pretty hard. It made it pretty hard for families to return home, because many found like their properties damaged, or it was rented to someone else, and some had to live in like hostels, churches, or temporary spaces. Basically, it wasn't very. It was very hard. It was like basically trying to go back into like starting a whole new life, because you basically lost everything. And certain neighborhoods would refuse to sell or rent to any Japanese Americans because the war ended, but the discrimination didn't. And after the war, the job market and the trade union often excluded Japanese Americans due to discrimination. So a lot of older immigrants had to work in lower paying labor jobs, and it basically explains how like long-term economic effects of incarnation. This visit connects to racialization, how like, because for example a whole group was treated badly, or they were judged based on identity and how they looked. Institutional racism, because discrimination carried out through the government policy. Overall, I feel like visiting the Japanese museum, or Japanese American Museum, helped me like better understand the real experience behind this period of history, and how I felt like it was in the war. And I know that I wouldn't know it, like I wouldn't understand it completely because I didn't go through it, but it helped me understand like a part of how they felt. And I also learned how removal, incarceration, and discrimination affected families' housing, and jobs. And it wasn't temporary, but for years, because even after the war ended, the discrimination didn't. So it really affected Japanese Americans a lot. And during this experience, it felt really real. Like I really like how they had like a built-in uh, room of like the camp rooms that they would put in, and it felt like really real. Like when I walked into that room, I was like, I almost screamed a little too loud, because when the baby music started crying, I was like, oh my gosh! Like I thought, like before knowing the context that the lady helped explain, I thought it was like during the war, like a baby died, and it was like basically it was like the war happening, and you walk into like an empty room with no people, but there was just like a baby crying in a crib. Like that was like the experience I was picturing in my head. But thankfully, she cleared that up, and now I understand like the full meaning behind the baby noise. And I had to tell my friends to like check it out, because it low-key scared me, because like it was dark, it was like the floor was creaky, and like a sound was a sound was there, like it was like an ominous sound. It was like it was like and it was like it low-key scared me, and it made my friend a little scared because I told her that I was scared. So yeah.